Hello everyone, how's it going? It's Mostrino here. And as you can probably tell by the title, I'm going to be doing a breakdown of my fall remix. Now I'm going to be honest, I wasn't actually planning on doing a breakdown of this remix, considering I had just done one of the My Eyes Betray Me remix not too long ago. But this remix has actually become by far my most popular track on YouTube and on SoundCloud, despite being my most recent one. So first of all, thank you. I was not expecting nearly as much support on this remix as I have gotten. So thank you so much for that, and I am so happy to hear that you are all enjoying it. And for that reason, I thought, okay, I think that this remix merits a breakdown. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Now, I've got a few short kind of announcements and disclaimers before I hop in, and then we're going to, of course, hop in. First thing is that this remix is actually going to be out on, all those platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, the other, all those streaming platforms. It's going to be out on May 22nd. So keep that in mind. But something else that I've noticed is since really my only ways to communicate information with you guys has been either, in like the descriptions of my videos, or taking a chunk out of a video that's supposed to be for something else, like this one for the breakdown, taking a chunk out of it at the beginning just to keep you guys up to date. I thought it would be beneficial to make a Discord server so that it's easier for me to keep you up to date and so you guys know what's going on. So the link to that will be in the description. It's pretty small right now in terms of channels, but it's really just for us to chill and for me to keep you guys up to date and keep you guys in the know. Now, the only other things that I want to say really quickly before we hop in. First of all, I'm probably not going to be playing full sections of this remix, partially to save time, but also partially because they're probably not even going to play properly. This remix is quite heavy on the CPU. So if you haven't heard the remix, or if it's been a while, feel free to go ahead and re-listen so you can refresh your memory. And while you're at it, go ahead and listen to the original if you haven't already. That'll give you a good kind of frame of reference to compare this remix to the original in terms of, how similar or how different it is. And if you didn't know, YMIR, the person who made the original track Fall, not only listened to all the remixes, but also did a sort of reaction first listen to them as part of a live stream. So I'm going to be including clips from there. I think it'll be kind of fun to include throwing little clips from there in this breakdown. But if you want to see his full reaction, I'm going to include a link to that stream in the description. The last thing that I wanted to say really quickly is, in efforts to save as much CPU as possible, I'm turning on Smart Disable, which, if you remember from the last breakdown, can be pretty janky. So if something that's supposed to be playing doesn't play right away, that's why. And I'm also turning off these tempo automations, because actually this track is supposed to go from, 167.341 BPM to 176.123, and then at the end it goes back down to 140. But I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but with FL Studio, when you have a big project and you do a tempo automation, it's just unplayable. So I'm going to have to turn those off. So if the intro and outro feel faster than normal, it's because they are faster than normal. And then the last thing is that if you've seen my My Eyes Betray Me remix, I'm probably not going to go into nearly as much depth with this remix just because I don't want it to be super long. So if there's anything that you wanted me to go over that I didn't go over, please let me know, leave a comment or let me know some other way. And if I get a lot of those, I'll make a follow-up video. If I get a few of those, then I'll just try and reply to those, in the comments or whatnot individually. I think that's everything that I wanted to say. So let's go ahead and hop into this. First thing, this is the entirety of the project file. It is by far my biggest project file yet. 105 tracks going this way. All right, and I'm just gonna go ahead, start out at the intro and go layer by layer. I actually, fun fact about this one is that the first thing that I made for this remix, because YMIR had actually given out the vocals before he had made it a remix competition, so I had started it back then. But when he decided to make it a remix competition, that was a big motivator for me to actually finish it by the deadline. But the first thing that I had made in this remix was actually that first kind of build-up thing. and then the drop, and then the intro. So I kind of had to make this intro keeping in mind that it's going to need to transition into that build-up, which was pretty tricky, but I might talk about that a little bit more in just a second. We've got the vocal with a little reverse going into it, just like in the My Eyes Betray Me remix.
All thieves and lovers are faithful.
And something that I actually want to mention real quick with this one is that of all of the remixes that I've done, this is the one where I've had to do the least amount of processing on the vocals. I know that it looks like a bit here, but most of these are just being automated in for small sections that I'll talk about in a moment. But for the most part, all I had to do was put the tiniest bit of reverb, very low mix, very low delay on the supermassive, and then a slight bit of air, and that's actually just it. So these vocals came in super clean, so it was very it was very nice to be able to work with them and not have to do that much on them. But one of those things that I was automating in that, like I said, I was going to mention is this kilohertz ring mod, which the effect you'll hear in just a second.
Or violin.
That kind of really gritty, I don't really know how to describe it, but that texture that it gives is coming from this. If I turn it off, you'll hear the difference.
Violin.
Right? Way different than with the ring mod on. Then, might as well really quickly talk about these guys that come in over here. These are just like little shakers in here. Just kind of there to keep the rhythm. Now on to the next layer, we've got these intro chords. And if we look at what these actually are, it's just a bunch of sine waves. We got up to the 4th harmonic, but these are going down in level a little bit. And then we've got an ensemble on them. And that's really all that's giving these guys their sound. Just sine waves with the kilohertz ensemble. And if we look at the chords that they're actually playing, nothing really particular of note here, I would say, aside from the fact that we've got this, the harmonic minor major 7th in there on that last chord. Because I feel like the original as a whole kind of had that, dramatic kind of edge to it. So kind of following that a little bit with the chord progression, but aside from that, not really much to note. You've just got these triads going downwards, and that's about all. Now on to the next layer. Here's what YMIR said when he first heard the bass.
Oh! The bass!
Yeah, so let's look at how I actually made this bass. And yeah, you can already see the CPU kind of getting a little wacky here. This kind of bass fill I've done quite a few times in the past, actually. If you've heard my other tracks, probably the first iteration of it is from Zero to Nero. Then we have a bit more of a developed version in Funky Business. And then it makes another appearance in Trippin'. But as you could probably tell from those little snippets, the difference between those and this one is that those come in build-ups and drops. They're super, present and high energy, whereas this one is coming in the intro. So what I was trying to do with this is I wanted it to grab your attention, but it still needed to not feel out of place in the intro. Again, I'm not going to go into super deep detail because if I did this for every single sound, this would be way too long. But basically, at its core, we've got, of course, the Icon has kick, detuned, spread wavetable, but just a couple of other wavetables in there, adding layers as well, doing some linking the frames to the macro to give them a bit more movement. And then this is something that if I break down a lot of the other sounds on here, you might see this more often as well, is that I was going through wavetables, seeing which ones I like the sound of, and I kind of discovered on accident that the first few frames of this gross wavetable actually make for a really, really nice sub, because I've got all of the harmonics that I like to have in there, aside from just the fundamental frequency, but not some of the more dissonant ones that I try to avoid. And then really it's just a bunch of compression, distortion, and then we've got some of these filters here for that movement. And the reverbs and these filters here at the end are for making it fit in with the intro. Because if I take that stuff out, then it feels, you know, a lot more like the ones that I just showed you that are meant to be in like drops and whatnot. Versus when we have those filters and reverb back in, notice how it instantly becomes so much more subdued and is able to fit with the rest of the intro much more nicely. And the one other thing that I wanted to say though is that I actually also had recorded the reverb on them and reversed it so that it came in a bit more smoothly. And I used this Cymatics City ambience, and I did a bit of volume automation to follow that kind of same pattern as well. And when I put these together with the bass, so without it sounds like what I just played, but then with it, and now not only does it have that smooth fade out at the end of it with the reverb tail, but it also is smooth going into it. All right, next up we've got these guys. We've got an electric piano from Labs, a soft piano from Labs, a key zone, which is another piano plugin that I think I might have shown you guys before, but this is on the electric piano preset. And then here we've got a key zone on the Yamaha Grand Piano preset, which is doing those kind of higher notes with a ton of reverb on it. And I noticed that, you know, doing those higher notes in that kind of pattern made it have a much more kind of cinematic, dramatic feel, which is kind of what I was going for. Because when I was thinking about this intro, and I was thinking about what do I want to do so that it fits with the feel that I've already made with the build-up and the drop, but still works as an intro, because if you've heard the remix, which I hope you have, you know that the build-up and the drop are super high energy. I needed something low energy to contrast with the high energy parts, but I also needed it to actually work and go into that part. So I felt like, okay, the one underlying kind of element that I want to be consistent throughout this whole intro build up drop thing is how dramatic it is. So here's how this one sounds. So it works really nicely with the key zone. And then we also have those same handbells on another pattern down here, doing some other notes. Then, as you heard, these strings come in. And these strings are all just from the BBC Symphony Orchestra. We've got violins, this one, these are violas, and then here we've got cello. And then the other thing that comes in at the end of this is this tremolo violin. And then I did kind of that pitch down at the end to transition into the next section. And the reason why I actually included this violin in particular, if you didn't notice, is because this is the part in the lyrics where he says,
by that design I'm a player of your violin. Violin.
So, I mean, you know, I did something similar with the My Eyes Betray Me remix, but you know that when he says violin, we got to bring in a violin, right?
By that design I'm a player of your violin. Violin.
Moving on, we've got this ambience here, which I suppose I'll start off with this first pattern. Which is just 2 Labs pads, which, by the way, if you aren't familiar with Labs, it's completely free and you get a ton of beautiful pads like this. Now these sound like this, and I'm doing kind of a bit of a swell with the volume automation in here. Now this next layer is called 2020 pad. And if you're wondering why it's called 2020 pad, it's because it's a pad I made in 2020. And really I was just trying to fill up this intro as much as possible. So I was just adding more pads and more layers to really nail the atmosphere. So yeah, this pad that I made in 2020 I think fit pretty well. Then I've got this drone, which is called Numb Drone. And if you're wondering why it's called Numb Drone, it's because it's the drone that I used in Numb, in my track Numb. Just kind of there to add a bit more tension. Then we've got this night ambience. Now, if you're wondering what these whispered screams are, that's just me going into the mic like, ah, and then putting a ton of reverb on it just to kind of fill up space and, you know, add a little bit more. So those come in at this second half here. Then, you know, even more ambience coming in with the rain. And even more rain in the second half. Except this is more like a rain on a roof. It's got a bit of a different texture to it than just normal rain. And then some wind as well. And even though each of these ambient natural samples are pretty quiet on their own, you know, they add up when you put them all together. And add a bit more of like a realistic texture to the intro. Then onto these effects, I've got these like cashmere pluck samples with a ton of reverb on them to, again, add a bit more suspense and drama to the intro. And then here I've got one an octave lower. And then here is just a little bit of a sweep, very, very subtle, but just to kind of keep cueing that we're adding, you know, some more elements in here. All right, and then this last element that I think also does a very good job of adding to the kind of whole dramatic feel of this are these two clock samples, which I believe are both from Kashmir, and they sound like this. And as you can see, they've got, you know, delay on them, frequency shifter, pancake to pan them around, and then a bunch of reverb and other stuff in there as well. And then in the second half, where these shakers from the beginning come in, we also get that second clock going double time as well. Which again is just to kind of assert the rhythm a bit more. Now let's move on to these next elements in the second half of the intro. In terms of the drums, we still have this shaker here. But we also bring in a few other hats and perks as well. And then later on, we even bring in these cinematic hits, which are Kashmir samples. And this deeper one. So all together. And that's, again, just kind of making it very clear that we're building up to something here. Then, in terms of the vocals, it's all kind of the same, except I've got this little bit here. It's just this part, but an octave higher. You know, with a bit of delay and other effects on it as well. Then, we've got these verse chords. And I guess we can look at the chord progression as well, because there's one thing that I want to note in that department. But in terms of how I made the chords themselves, it's just a triangle and a saw, but what's really giving it its character is this triangle LFO on the master pitch that's giving it that sort of vibrato sound. And in terms of the chord progression itself, the one thing that I wanted to note is this use of this A here, which is from outside of the key, but I thought that contrasting it with this chord right before gave it a really nice sound. Here's how it sounds like. It's this guy here. Which, in some other context probably sounds really, really off, but I think in this specific position works really nicely. To kind of give it a bit of an unsettling feel without throwing the listener off too much. Now this next one I've tried playing before, and it seems like the CPU really doesn't like it, but hopefully you guys can bear with me as I try and play this here. So that actually wasn't as bad as I expected. This bass is just the same as the Reese bass, but with a few tweaks. But the main thing is putting this phaser on here, giving it that kind of, phasey quality. But also doing a little bit of phase modulation on that gross wavetable to give the sub some movement as well. Then we've got this guy. First is the electric piano. Then we've got this organ, which is a Labs organ. And then we've got this other organ, which is, if you're unfamiliar with Decent Sampler, it's like free and you can load in a bunch of different like instruments that people have made in there. And if you look, there are a ton of ones out there, and there are some really good ones in there as well, like all for free. So one of them is this spooky Halloween organ, which worked really nicely as a layer with the other organ. This one sounds like this. So together. And again, just using an organ to give it more of a dramatic kind of feel that I feel carries throughout the beginning of this remix. Then these were all of those muted channels, which were just a bunch of pianos, but the main thing that I want to talk about with this is that what I did is I put them on a channel with a kilohertz delay, and I messed around with the time knob a ton, which gave it this kind of really weird feedbacky sound. So then I just recorded that into Edison, and then dragged that into the project file, and we ended up with this. So you can hear that kind of glitchy sound that the delay gives you, which I think works as a really nice background element. And then here, handbells, same deal, except these, they don't really have reverb on them. They're a lot more front and center in terms of these instruments here. Alright, next up, ambience. But they're basically all Labs pads except for this Dave Choir, which is another decent sampler instrument that I'm assuming was made by a guy named Dave. Next up, we've got this detuned drone, which is similar to the Numb drone, but different in sound. And again, that just functions as like a nice little background element to add more tension. But then we've got this granular glass, which basically what I did is I took a sample of someone like breaking and sweeping a bunch of glass, and then I stretched it a ton so that it got, really grainy and with all those artifacts of stretching. And then I put a ton of effects on it, a lot of reverb, as this pitch shifting, as you can see, and then I rendered that out, and it sounds like this. And it kind of functions as a bit of a riser at the end with pitch shifting it up and whatnot. And I use the kilohertz pitch shifter to really add to those artifacts. And I think that stuff like this is what helps give this intro a really neat, kind of glassy, cold, icy kind of sound, which I think is a really neat sound because it's not one that I hear too often. I added a bit of thunder to give it a bit more impact on the second section. It's kind of like that deep rumbling sound. And then we've got a few other impacts for this section. And then I just realized that I had forgotten to talk about this tremolo violin that comes in, so let me say that real quickly. It's similar to this one, but not the same. This one sounds like this. You know, kind of following the melody that's going on there. Whereas this one's just there to add tension. You know, kind of sustaining that high note as the other instruments are playing. Now let's go back in here and keep talking about this. This next sample might be familiar to you. Let me play it and see if you can guess it first. Yeah, it's the AOL dial-up sound, but I just put a bunch of effects on it. Without any, it sounds like this. And then with, of course, fits in the intro much more without being as jarring. And I thought that that would be just kind of like a nice, fun background element to throw in there. Everything else, we've just got some more sweeps. And then finally, we've got this riser. And yeah, that's the entirety of the intro. And now we finally move on to the build-up. Alright, and again, let's just go layer by layer. So first thing is we have these drums. And, you know, we've got the kick, of course, but really it's just a bunch of amen breaks that I chopped to make them, you know, really high energy, and then I'm kind of filtering them in. And I really, really like the effect that does of really asserting that we're going to get into a very high energy moment here. Then we've got these vocals. And if you've seen the My Eyes Betray Me breakdown, this is using the same technique that I did in that build-up kind of section of that remix as well, with the M tremolo. But yeah, this is just the M tremolo, the rate going downwards, bringing in the reverb at the end. These are just super distorted using Camel Crusher and Kilohertz as well for the distortion, along with a bunch of other plugins. And then here I've got all of these different layers to make, you know, a bit of a harmony at the end. Then we've got the lead, which is with the chords, I think, but if I play it by itself, it sounds like this. Yeah, super aggressive. And this one's just a saw with a ton of distortion, but this layer is, you know, some really aggressive basses, again with a ton of distortion and compression. And then with the chords, sounds like this. And if we want to take a look at the chords themselves, the way that they have the character that they do is that, you know, just like normal, I have all of these saw waves here with the detune and spread and whatnot, but I've got them all phase modulated by this wavetable, and I'm modulating the phase of that wavetable by this other wavetable. So, you know, there's a bunch of stuff going on here in that regard. Something that I think is worth mentioning here is that I'm using this plugin called D-Blue Stretch that gives it like a very stretchy and grainy feel, and I'm bringing that in, and that's kind of helping with the whole texture of this. Then we've got this bass, two bass parts. I'll talk about this one first. And if you're wondering how I made this one, because it's like super phasey and whatnot, this, of course, Icon has kick. We've got to have it modulated by this oof wavetable. And yes, this is actually a stock wavetable in Phase Plant. They have one called oof. They have one called ew, burpee, gross, as we've met already, Twitter. So, you know, they have pretty interesting names for these wavetables. But what's really going on is that this flanger over here, I'm modulating the offset, and the flanger is really the main thing that's giving it that movement. But this other bass in here, which maybe you guys were wondering about, this guy, basically what was going on here, and I kind of learned this from actually a stock preset in Phase Plant made by Protostar. I analyzed that, and I was able to realize how you get that kind of oscillation with these kind of neuro basses. The way that it's done is that you have two sine waves and you slightly detune each of them, and then once you distort that, you get that really nice sound, and bringing in a little bit of noise makes it really crunchy as well. So I did that, but I also expanded on it by adding, of course, the Icon has kick wavetable, but doing phase modulation on both of these sine waves just a little bit to make it a whole lot crunchier. And then, of course, doing some even more phase modulation on here and some other effects in here as well. But if I play what the original preset sounds like, yeah, here it is. If I play what the original one sounds like, it sounds like this. Right, so you can hear already where kind of that idea was coming from, but you can also hear how I expanded on it with basses like these. Next, we've got these brass hits as well, which are from the BBC Symphony Orchestra. Then we've got these effects here, just a bunch of Kashmir sweep downs. But then in this section, sorry for the really bad CPU stuff here, that's why I'm not really playing these sections in full. But in that section there, I've got this guy that comes in as well, which is just a bunch of, again, Kashmir glitches that I processed and chopped together as kind of like a background element to really keep the energy going. Some sweeps up. This siren from this first part that you might have heard. Also a Kashmir sample, and these kind of sirens, again, really help to add, you know, make it more dramatic, add more tension. Then, of course, we got the same riser from the Buildup. And then the siren going up as well. And yeah, those are all the layers to the Buildup. So then let's go ahead and move on to the drop.
That's your
Drum and bass, baby!
So again, let's just go layer by layer. I would say, you know, it's kind of funny because, yeah, I mean, it's drum and bass. So, of course, you would expect the two driving elements to be the drums and the bass, and also the vocal in this case, though. But I feel like, again, the drums and the bass contribute a ton to the energy. So let's take a little bit of a look at these drums. And the way that I kind of went about this, because I don't know if you guys know this, but this is actually only the second heavy drum and bass track I've made, at least in terms of getting further than like a drop. Because of course well, maybe not of course, but I've messed around with like neuro stuff in terms of, you know, doing a little drop or a tiny project here and there. But in terms of going further than that, this is my second one ever, my first one being, of course, Zero to Nero. So I wasn't really sure ahead of time how I was going to go about making this and making it sound the way I wanted. So in terms of the drums, really what I did to get the drums as high energy as I wanted was whenever I thought that they weren't high energy enough, instead of tweaking the drums that I already had, I just kept adding more and more and more layers, and it kept getting noisier and noisier. But I actually think for this specific track, that strategy actually worked out. So I can break down these drums a little bit. First, I'll talk about the ones that aren't in the pattern. So here, these are all just kind of drum break samples that I've spliced together. Another sample. And then these fills are from YMIR. And then in terms of the drums that are actually in this pattern, kick, cymatic sample, we've got another kick in there. Let's take a look at the snare, because the snare has a lot of layers, and then we'll look at this afterwards as well. So we've got this noisy snare, this cymatic sample, you know, big meat of the snare. Then we've got the snare tail, which is an AU5 snare tail. If you've seen my My Eyes Betray Me remix, I've mentioned that I like to use this one a lot. It sounds like this. And of course, you know, I'm doing some effects on it to get rid of the attack and the transient and just keep the tail. And that's adding a lot to the character of the snare. But then we got to make it DMB. So we add in these high-pitched characteristic tonal snares, which are really just dubstep snares that I pitched way up. And then we've got this one. And then we've got what I like to call this plocky snare, because that was the best word that I could think of to describe it. And yeah, those are all the layers for the snare. So if I turn the rest of these off, the snare sounds like this. So you can hear all of the elements coming together, all of the layers coming together to contribute to that snare. This comes back to the mentality of just adding more drums, because these are like, I'm spamming these hats and these shakers. Take a listen. All together. It's almost just noise, but somehow it worked out for this specific case. And then I've also got these claps in here adding the energy. All together we get. But I'm sure you can already imagine how important getting all of those elements is to the whole energy and impact of the drop, because if these drums weren't what they are, the drop would not have nearly as much energy and impact as it does. Then let's move on to the vocal.
That's your
So let me talk about these for a second. So these, for the vocal chops, I just kind of went into each sample and manually repitched them, as you can see. But how about these guys? If you're listening on headphones or like stereo speakers, you can tell that they're panning around because I've got this pancake on them. But I've also got a bunch of air and this no TT on it as well, you know, making it really, really bright. So that's giving it that texture, which I think works really nicely to contrast with the first part, because with this drop, I thought it would be really neat to try and do that kind of call and response kind of thing, where we have these vocal chops as like this first section, and then these much choppier, panning, brighter ones as the response here. Then we have these chords. And if we take a look at how I made these, what's giving it that kind of metallic character is this comb filter that I've got in there. And also the fact that I've got like some pretty high oscillators in there as well is giving it, again, that kind of that texture that it has. That's a lot less warm than your regular supersaws. Then I rendered out these basses to save CPU. Here's how they sound. Now, I won't go through how I made most of these basses just because there are so many here, as you can see by this, that it would take a while to go over all of them. But let me at least talk about this guy, because I feel like it's prominent enough to warrant talking about it. There's 2 layers. This is the first one, which is basically the bulk of the sound. And if we want to look at how I made this, we've got this sub here, and then this other one that's just reinforcing that fundamental. And then of course we've got the icon has kick detuned kind of spread wavetable in there as well. If you've seen me talking about these, you'll see that the icon has kick wavetable, which is a serum wavetable by the way, comes up a lot because I think it's a very powerful and very effective wavetable for this kind of style and getting really thick, wide basses. In terms of the processing, it's all just, distortion, compression, and, a bit of EQ and whatnot to get it really nice in there. Of course, the no TT and whatnot. And the other layer is this guy, which this is, if you've seen my Eyes Betray Me remix, this is the Deep Reese. I brought it back in here because I thought that it fit as a very nice widening layer. And then in this half, and as you can see, I brought in some other sounds in here like this guy, and then this growl. And also I do want to mention that all of the bass sounds in this entire track are made by me from scratch in Phase Plant. Going over all of them would take a very long time, but if there are any in particular that you want me to talk about, again, just let me know and I can maybe break down how I made those. Then we've also got, as a layer to these vocals, we've got this guy that comes in. And as far as this goes, what this actually is, the reason why it sounds like this instead of this is because I've got a very low sine wave that's going along with it, and when I distort it, when I distort that and the saw wave, it gives it that special kind of texture, and then I just use the filter so that you can't actually hear the low sine wave itself, but the sound that it gets when you distort it is still present in there because the overtones go above the filter. And it makes it a lot more intense, if you ask me, which again is kind of what I was going for with this drop. Very intense stuff. Yeah, it's the same sound, but instead of being a sustained note, it's doing a little bit of an arp pattern. And here it's doing a different thing, but as you can see, it's getting faster and faster and faster and louder as well. We've got some sweep downs, all Kashmir samples, I believe. So of course, all together, giving it a bit more impact. For the second half of the drop, I let the vocal do more of the words in the chorus. So yeah, I think that's everything. Okay, awesome. We're done with the first drop now. Let's move on. So I guess we can start with these. Let's talk about this little transition really quick. Same kind of technique that I did in the My Eyes Betray Me remix, where we keep the rides going, but then we kind of pitch them down. As far as the vocal, I kind of let it reverb out and then bring in the reverb of this next section of the vocal. With this part that's just kind of like a reverb layer filling things out. And finally, I've got a few impacts in here. And then finally, I've got this bass that kind of goes up, to again kind of indicate that we've got a transition here. So now we're on to this kind of like midsection portion.
Oh! This makes me want a samba, dude. Whoa!
So again, let's just go layer by layer. So first, we've got these drums. I already knew ahead of time for this midsection that I wanted to do something very different, very interesting with the drum pattern in this midsection. Go kind of a lot more textured, and I'm glad that YMIR noticed and pointed out the drum design in this. So let's talk about that real quick. So a lot of it's just choosing a bunch of different perks and layers and repitching them, processing them so that they fit, and getting them in the right pattern where we have this first kind of rhythm here. And then we juxtapose that with the second rhythm here. But something that I do want to mention really quickly, even if it's kind of trivial, but this sound that comes in right here, that really wet kind of sound, is actually one that I made myself a while before in a different project. So I figured it kind of fit really nicely in here, because without it, and then with, it's interesting because where I made this was in a completely different context than this, but you know, sometimes you can go back into your old samples and they fit really nicely, like with the 2020 pad and the Numb drone as well. And then here we bring in the stadium kick from Kashmir with a bit of processing on it, and we also bring in the stadium clap as well as the noisy snare, just to make it hit much harder. And again, to juxtapose with the much thinner, smaller kind of percussive elements in this section. Then we've got the vocal, which first we just have the normal vocal.
We thieves and lovers will keep up our urges to sin.
But then I've also got these two layers. This first one, basically I recorded the vocal and put in Edison and used Edison's blur tool to make it super kind of washed out and reverby. Then for this first one, I panned it a bit to the right and pitched it up an octave. And the reason why I used Edison's blur tool instead of just normal reverb is because reverb blurs the sound after it has that dry signal come in. Then it has, you know, the reverb tail, which is a lot blurrier, but the Edison blur tool does it before, during, and after, so we get that washy sound throughout. And I used the new Stretch Pro mode, so it's, even though it's pitched an octave, the formants are still the same. So that's what gives it a kind of interesting character as well. And then I've got this one, which by contrast is panned a bit to the left and is not pitched. So together, we get a really wide reverb layer. It helps fill out this section since the vocal's kind of a lot drier.
We thieves and lovers.
Versus
we thieves and lovers will keep up our urges to sin.
Next up we have the bass. If we take a look at how this one was made real quickly, it's still the Icon has kick wavetable as usual. And then again, like I said, we see that gross usage a bit more as well, except this one's detuned and spread because I've got this slice EQ that's just cutting out all the sides from the bass region, so I can still spread these out without having to worry about phase discrepancies in the bass frequencies. And then in the second half, I open up this low pass filter here, which makes it feel a lot bigger, and I like using opening and closing it in this section in particular because then it makes the whole thing feel very dynamic. And then the 2020 pad makes another appearance because, you know, I just wanted to throw it in here to really fill out the rest of things that needed to be filled out. And again, using that volume automation to make it really dynamic. And I feel like it blends really nicely with the blurred vocals from earlier. And then I've just got a little bit of noise that comes in during like these reverby sections.
I urge is to sin.
And what makes this different from just a normal sweep down is instead of the noise actually going down, it just gets quieter, but it stays the same frequency. Whereas something like this, you notice that it actually goes downward. And then I do the same thing over here, except it goes down and up. And then we also have this other sweep up, just to smooth out this next transition.
You bastard! I love it!
As far as this part right before it, it's just the vocals. And, well, of course, the sweep downs from earlier. And this lab soft piano. And that's it. And the reason why I wanted to make this section so small and have so few elements is so that this kind of jump scare section catches you all the more off guard because you were just hearing the super relaxing section, which it's one of those ideas where I had in my head where it's like, wow, that would be so silly. But then I decided to actually do it. And the fact that people actually really digged it was such a pleasant surprise to me. Because at first, when I first thought of it, yeah, let's just make it super, super soft and quiet and then go extremely hard and then cut it out immediately afterwards. I thought it would just be kind of funny, but I'm extremely glad that I did it because it turned out to be quite a success, actually. It's kind of the same deal as before, but we'll break it down anyway. In terms of the drums, so we've got these guys. It's the same layers as in the drop, so nothing new there. Then we've got this first drum break. Second drum break. And the fills in the middle there, of course. Third drum break, and these are all the same as the drop. But the new one that I added just for this section is this fourth drum break. So adding that extra drum break makes it even louder and even more intense than the drop without it. And then with. You can see it's definitely a very clear difference. Now in terms of the vocal, we go from, you know, relatively unprocessed, just a little bit of reverb, a little bit of brightness, to extremely distorted. And if we take a look at, okay, how did I distort that one? This is actually just the kilohertz distortion, but I'm using the fold back mode instead of the usual saturate and overdrive ones that I usually use, and that's what was able to give it this very specific tone with the vocal distortion. Then we've got the bass, which is not the same one as this one in the drop. You can see that this one is a lot grittier, I would say. And I've called it the in all caps. And if we take a look at how I made the, we've got the sub with a little bit of noise, and then the gross wavetable, of course, helping add some of those subharmonics as well, so it's actually functioning as a sub this time. There's no unison or anything. And then here we've got the neuron and icon has kick layers that I think I've talked about before. I think I used those layers in the intro Reese, as well as a little bit of remap on the icon has kick. And in terms of the processing, kind of same deal as always. Got to run the no TTs, got to run the distortion, and then, yeah, just a few other small things. Saturator as well, getting it extremely thick. And if we look at those layers, this one is actually just the same bass as this, except it's tamed with like EQ and whatnot, taking out all the lows and whatnot. And then this guy is this the number 2, which is the same technique that I was telling you about before. Not the same bass, but the same technique, right? We've got these two where this one's shifted up a bit, this one is shifted down a bit, and then the noise and just distorting it extremely heavily. And that's all you got to do to get this sound. It's remarkably simple, I would say, for a sound that's so intense. So together, a ton of impacts here to make it, again, really hard hitting. You know, all together. And then, as you might have noticed, we also have this siren in here, which is the same one from the Buildup, except a lot more aggressive. Making it extremely dramatic and impactful. And that's everything for this section. Just a ton of drums, distorted vocal, extremely heavy bass, and a bunch of impacts and the siren. And then right after that, with no warning, we go right back in to the very melodic, soft section that we were in right before.
Take on the leap and I swear.
So again, vocals same as before, except that we do have two things. One is we have the this reverb automation coming in.
I swear that you're.
And then just like from the intro with that effective violin, we also got the ring mod coming in here to do the exact same thing. And then over here, ambience, light rain from the Cymatics Life Pack, and ocean waves from the Cymatics Life Pack. And then we've got these effects that are coming in because if you've heard the remix, you know that a big section is coming. So now going back to the piano, if you watch YMIR's reaction, you'll notice that he pointed out that there's a major chord in here, and he is absolutely right. We use the major 4 chord instead of the regular minor 4 chord, which uses this A here. And this is kind of interesting because in the intro we had used A as well, but A was kind of like a dissonant, uneasy note, whereas here, if anything, it makes it almost even more pretty than without it. I'll do a before and after. Here's If I Didn't Borrow. In fact, that last one almost sounds outright dissonant despite being in the key of C minor. But when we use that A, it's that characteristic Dorian note, which I actually think it works very nicely.
Take on the leap and I swear that you're.
Yeah, it's playing decently, but the CPU's struggling a little bit there, so let's just pause it and break this down. Here's really the first time that you actually properly hear the chorus, but since we're getting so close to the end of the song, I wanted to make this as impactful as possible, and personally, this is my favorite stack that I have ever made, so I definitely want to take a moment to talk about this. So first of all, with the vocal, you'll notice it's not just the dry vocal in here. So here, what I actually did, I don't know why I keep saying we, I was the only one that worked on this, but what I actually did here is instead of just putting distortion on the vocal, I put it into a multipass so that none of these low frequencies in the vocal were distorted, but only the mids got pretty heavily distorted with both kilohertz distortion on the saturate mode and the saturator. And the reason why I did this was because now I can do the distortion per band. I can distort the mid frequencies differently than the high frequencies so that I can really dial it in the way that I want it to sound. So without this, it sounds like this. Versus with. You'll notice it's a lot noisier, which on face value might not actually seem like a good thing, but since all of these other elements are so noisy, it fits well and it's able to still punch through because I want the vocal to be the main thing. And it's also worth mentioning here that we have this, since there's a little bit of a break, I put reverb on all of these elements in fact, but I'll just play it with the vocal to fill in this gap here because it would sound kind of awkward if I just cut them off. Right, so that's just kind of there filling in the gap. Then we've got this lead. Which is following the vocal melody. And this is actually a lead that I had made in another project, so it was very easy for me to bring it into here. We'll break this down really quickly. Just a bunch of saws that are extremely distorted. And then I've got the comb filter here, but what I'm actually doing is that I'm using this triangle LFO on the frequency of the comb filter, so it's almost giving it a vibrato sound without actually changing the master pitch, which is kind of a neat technique that I had figured out while making this lead. And again, very noisy, just like how we got those vocals sounding. Then the chords have two layers. The first one are what I call these AU5 chords because it's a technique that AU5 had made a video about not too long ago about a completely different way to make super saw stacks. And this is actually the only instance of Serum in this entire remix, just because his technique requires using these chaos modulators, which are random modulators. And it's not that Faceplant doesn't have those, because it does, but these go up to 1,000 hertz in terms of the rate, whereas the Faceplant ones only go up to 50 hertz, and we need to crank the rate up all the way for this technique to work. So that's how this one sounds like. You know, very buzzy. And then we've got this Faceplant super saw layer. And if you look at these, we've got, again, a bunch of saws, really wide, fully spread, and then we've got the mono chords here with a little bit of noise that is actually in stereo here. And then in terms of the processing, we've got the no TT, but not all the way. Same deal with the distortion. And then the stereo on the comb filter already makes it really wide, and you can see that I'm doing that same comb filter sort of vibrato technique that I did with the lead. But also, we've got this slice EQ boosting the highs of the sides that I think I also did in the My Eyes Betray Me remix. So all of these things add up to make this saw stack extremely wide. So combine that with the Serum chords. And I would say they complement each other nicely. Now onto the bass, we've got this guy. Kind of phasey, Reese bass. And if we take a look at how I made this one, again, we've got the gross kind of sub deal going on with the noise and distorting it all. And then, of course, the Icon has kick. So, as you can see, you can probably already tell just from this breakdown the sort of trends that or you can see in my production, because there are some things that I just know work, so I maybe tweak things and experiment with them a little bit, but at least I know that I've got a sort of foundation that's reliable and that I know is going to work. Next, we have these strings and brand. And these guys are, well, the strings actually are from Labs, but the rest are BBC Symphony Orchestra, yeah, which, if you didn't know, are made by the same people who made Labs. And then, of course, we do some processing on those. And then the other thing that we've got in here is this choir, which is a bunch of YMIR samples repitched to fit the chord progression. If you saw my Eyes Betray Me remix video, I did the same thing, actually. And you can hear how they contribute, even just comparing them with the chords here. Versus with. You can see that they really make a big difference. And then something that is also making a massive difference are these impacts. Because as you can see, there are a ton of impacts here. I'm not going to go through them one at a time. The one thing that I will mention, though, is that this is not an impact. It's actually just crowd noise, which is a Jonas Aiden sample from one of his free sample packs. But anyways, the rest of these are a ton of samples stacked together. A lot of these ones are the YMIR sweeps that we've seen before, and these are some other impacts. But all together, it is like a monstrously huge sound. Take a listen. And those contribute so much to the impact of this section. And as you might have seen, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this sample or not, but this guy, I decided to throw it in here too, as well as this whole reverse here is just from the tail of this. So that it's kind of like the AOL dial, where I thought it would just be kind of a funny and goofy sample to throw in there. And now that you guys are seeing this breakdown, you know that it's there. And the only other part in this section that I need to talk about, or that I should talk about, is this guy right here. So as far as the drums go, it's just this drum break that I chopped up. And you can see I used some volume automation to make it even tighter as well. And then here we've got the bass, which I also chopped up. That, I don't need to explain how I made that, because it's the same way as the other one. You know, taking those sine waves, distorting them with the noise, you get a really, really crunchy sound. And yeah, I think that that's actually everything for this section. So awesome. We're almost there. I really hope that by the time that this goes out, it's not super long, because I've been recording for 2 hours here already. Anyways, next up we've got the build-up. So let's just go layer by layer. So first we've got this kind of pluck thing here. And this is just some saws that have an envelope to make them plucking, and then this ramp up is really what's carrying everything, because we've got the filter opening up, we've got the low pass filter opening up, we've got the decay of the envelope opening up, we've got the detune amount of the saw increasing as well. So that's what's making this get a lot bigger over time. Then we've also got these chords. And YMIR pointed out the major chord in here as well. And again, he's completely correct, except this time it's not the major 4 chord from earlier, but rather that harmonic minor usage that we're bringing in here, just to make it a little bit more suspenseful and dramatic. And this is just a bunch of saws with the filters opening up. Then we've got this bass. and even emphasizing that B note, the borrowed one. And I bet you can already figure out or guess how I made this. And your guess is probably exactly right. We've got the gross, we've got the sub, we've got the noise, and we've got the I can has kick. And it's just opening up over time. I've got it linked to this filter on the mixer track that's opening up. And then we've got some ambience. This is a playground sample from Cymatics Live. You know, just those kind of having those voices in the background, adding a bit more to this buildup, because this buildup comes after a huge, moment with the whole stack and the vocals. So I wanted to bring the energy way down and build it right back up before that drop. Then we have these pads, which is just this lab one and the Dave Choir coming back for this buildup. Then night ambience, same as the intro. From the direct pack, rain. More ambience, which in this case is the ocean ambience, and then some thunder. And then of course we've got the effect. And then the sweep ups and the riser as well. Cashmere samples and then the riser. And then the last element in this buildup is this drum break that we're just filtering in. Now, finally, we get onto this second and final drop. Alright, so we've got this little reverse kick before the drums, and then the drums, of course. And these drums are the same as in the first drop, except I think I made them a bit more intense, added some more layers and whatnot. Then we've got the vocal, which is similar to the first drop, except if you look in the first drop, you'll see that these points are empty. But for the second drop, I filled in those points just to kind of add a bit more energy. And then chords, same deal. Same chords as the first drop, except I'm filling in these previously empty gaps. And then bass. Very similar, but not exactly the same. Now let's talk about this new B section, because even to the point where I was starting to have to work on this second drop, I didn't know what I was going to do for it, but what I had known the entire time is two things. One is I didn't want it to be too similar to the first drop, and two is I didn't want it to be too different from the first drop. Basically, the way that I went about making it not too similar and not too different from the first drop is the first part will be very similar to the first drop, but then I can do the switch up in the second drop, so it's not going to be too jarring because the beginning of the drop is familiar. So when I do the switch up, you'll be able to latch onto it more easily, because even though it's different, you are already accustomed to the drums and to some of the other elements, so the switch up is more digestible. So the drums, still same deal. And these are all muted because I rendered them out for this lead thing. So this is the one that goes under, the wacky time. I just said, you know what, let's just try a bunch of different things that I've never tried before and see what happens. See if we can come up with something cool with just a bunch of madness. So here I've got a ring mod on this whole group of, bass vocal combination. A comb filter, which I'm automating with this macro. no TT, well, that's just standard. Distortion. But then we've got it linked to this tape stop. And yeah, actually, I'm just realizing, might as well mention, this is the first track that I've ever made where I've used all 125 mixer slots. So that was interesting, but I'll talk about that tape stop in a moment. This filter you can just ignore because again it's turned off, but this comb filter is what's giving it that movement. You know, almost sounding like phasey in a way. And then I've got these definitely not chords because they're definitely not chords, but since the lead is already occupied, I'm putting them in the chords section. And this, again, is just the same lead as before, except not only am I changing the frequency of the comb filter with that vibrato thing, but I'm also changing the actual pitch, so it is very vibrato-y. Then we've got this bass, which instead of being the bass from the first drop, it's the bass from this midsection, except just toned down a little bit. So again, just another way to kind of keep things different and do a bit of variation from the first drop. And then finally, we've got this distorted violin. And how can I forget to mention all of these effects that are helping add more energy and impact? Like especially here, you can probably imagine the difference that it makes. But yeah, that's this part. What's that at the end? That is the kilohertz tape stop working. And basically what the kilohertz tape stop does and what it is it's just a tape stop effect. It's really the only thing that it does, but at least it's very good at it. And I think the tape stop effect fits very nicely at the end of this switch. Sorry for the, again, the CPU troubles there, but you can hear the effect, right? And then this should be the same, except the only difference is now I've got this harmony thing here. So without it, and then this is just an octave up, I think. And again, you know, just going wacky and messing around with the comb filter and the ring mod and the volume automation, all of these things, I had no idea beforehand if they would work. And that's what allowed this switch up to be so different. Because I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I've ever heard any D&B tracks where the main sound is something like this. So it's something I'm quite proud of, you know, messing around and having that being able to work out. As far as the rest of the drop goes, the second half of the drop is very similar to the first half, except I'm using that different bass, those extra drum elements. And there are a few other small differences, but I think aside from that, it should be about the same. The one other difference there is this bass at the end isn't in the first drop. But I've talked about this bass a lot of times already. Again, it's just those sine waves, spreading them out a little bit, noise, distortion. But I really like how that slide at the end sounds. I think it sounds really nice and crunchy when you bring it down like that. And there's the outro. And again, normally it slows down to 140 BPM. And you would think, well, come on. This outro doesn't have that many elements. You should be able to at least do it for this part. But you know what? Let me show you. Right? Don't say I didn't tell you, okay? I literally told you. So we're not doing the tempo automation for that. But anyways, as far as these final elements go, I'll start with the piano. It's the Lab soft piano again, but with a lot more reverb than before. This lovely Valhalla Supermassive reverb that I'm putting on there, as well as a few other effects. And we're bringing back that major 4 chord from before, except now we're resolving it, I would say, very nicely to this C minor chord at the end, because we had an extremely dramatic, extremely tense remix on the whole, I would say. So having it resolve so nicely and in such a satisfying way, I think is something that is really neat and that I really wanted to do, and that I'm glad that I was able to do. And again, we've just got a bunch of effects to take us out of the drop. Right? And then this final thing with the vocals.
Come and fall right into
So YMIR was like,
What? You pitched my voice to do that? Sick!
and yup. So what I did with this vocal is, put a bunch of reverb on it and whatnot, and I had it filtering down just to kind of really clue the listener in that, okay, the song is about to end, because you might have thought, maybe I was going to extend the vocal and done like the first half of the chorus to end instead of just this first line. So by bringing this filter down was a very clear cue, like, this is as much as I'm going to play. And yeah, repitching it too. What made this so nice that would not have been possible if I was making this remix like 6 months ago before the Stretch Pro mode existed is the Stretch Pro mode, because it allows me to repitch the vocal without changing the formants, so it sounds so much more natural than with the normal Stretch mode where it changes the formants as well. And yeah, you can kind of just see the knob go around as I mess with the pitch here. And this was actually something that I had known that I wanted to do the whole time for this remix, was I wanted there to be a vocal line that did that exact melody. So thankfully, when I was repitching it, I was able to get away with it, because I was worried it would sound extremely unnatural, extremely weird, but in this case, I think it worked out. So yeah, that is the entire breakdown, the entire remix. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. And again, if there's something that I didn't say that you were hoping I would say, please let me know. I don't think that there's much more that I want to say. Again, remember, this is going to be out on all platforms on the 22nd, so keep that in mind. I'll send a reminder in the Discord server. And if you want to know what other stuff I have coming up, that is the place that I'm going to be letting you guys know. Aside from that, thank you for watching, and I hope you guys take care. I hope you guys stick around to see the music that I come out with in the future. If you're new just from this fall remix, I would appreciate it a ton if you stick around and see what I have to come. See you guys.